Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Greenwich Library's conversation with author Ijeoma Oluo. My name is Renee LaPointe Jameson, and I'm a racial equity, media, and programming consultant working with Greenwich Library to develop this new series titled Conversations About Race. Conversations About Race has the goal of encouraging ongoing conversations about race and racism, exploring issues of racial injustice, and sharing the tools for people to be better allies and take action in our community and beyond for racial justice. We are honored to have Ms. Oluo start off our series. Ijeoma Oluo is a Seattle-based writer, speaker, and internet yeller. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller, So You Want to Talk About Race, published by Seal Press. Named one of the Roots 100 Most Influential African Americans in 2017, one of the most influential people in Seattle by Seattle Magazine, one of the 50 most influential women in Seattle by Seattle Met, and winner of the 2018 Feminist Humanist Award by the American Humanist Society. Oluo's work focuses primarily on issues of race and identity, feminism, social and mental health, social justice, the arts, and personal essay. Her writing has been featured in The Washington Post, NBC News, Elle Magazine, Time, The Stranger, and The Guardian, among other outlets. Ms. Oluo is joined by interviewer Joanne Lipman. Joanne Lipman has served as editor-in-chief at USA Today and other national publications, and is currently the inaugural Distinguished Journalism Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. She is also the author of That's What She Said, What Men and Women Need to Know About Working Together. At the end of this talk, there will be time for questions by the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in to the chat box located on the right. We hope this talk contributes to your journey in anti-racism. This program is made possible by the Greenwich Library Board of Trustees and the Friends of the Greenwich Library through the support of generous donors. Thanks, and without further ado, the wonderful Ijeoma Oluo.
Thanks, and hello, everybody. I'm Joanne Lipman. Thank you, Renee, for that great introduction. And Ijeoma, it's such a pleasure to have you here, and especially today. Unfortunately, we're in a moment where, not just with the Black Lives Matter protests, but we just lost over the weekend two great civil rights leaders in John Lewis and P.T. Vivian. John Lewis, I'm interested in your perspective on this because he, right up till the end, he was heavily involved with civil rights issues, including Black Lives Matter. He went to Black Lives Matter Plaza, and he spoke about his optimism, which I found interesting. He talked about his hope and how hopeful it was to see people out protesting. So I guess, can you give us your perspective? Would you agree with what he saw? Do you think this is a hopeful and optimistic time?
You know, I don't think it's possible to look at everything that the great John Lewis went through, survived, fought for, and then question his hope, right? If anyone, I think, had the right to not be hopeful, it would be him. And what I'm seeing that's actually, you know, has shifted my perspective is seeing the hope that our elders who've been in the struggle a long time have. Because Angela Davis as well said that, you know, she's very glad that she's lived long enough to see this time. I think that it's amazing to see, you know, something must be different, or at least the potential for something different. And I look at that and I say, you know, if you've lived through this time and time again, you've lived through every movement as it's come and gone, if you see hope in there, then I need to as well. Because a lot of what I think robs us of hope is thinking this time is going to be like the last time. This will be like 2015, which will be like 2012, you know, which will be like the time before and the time before and the time before. But these are people who've been through all of it. And so that alone gives me hope. But what it's also helped me realize is that every time we do this, we have a real opportunity. Every time that we are getting out in the streets, that we have the chance to talk about these issues, to push for real change in our systems, we have a real opportunity. And this one, the momentum we have, gives us an even larger opportunity. And it's really about what we do with it.
So your book, actually, this is a great point that you're talking about of the scope of history, because you actually started your book 5 years ago. You were working on this in 2015. And what your book is those of you, by the way, who have not read it, really must read it. It is a phenomenal work that really opens your eyes and has such utility. But, you know, one of the things that's interesting is that when you started the book, and in the book, you are encouraging white people to talk about race, to have that conversation about race. But now we're in a moment where white people cannot wait to have that conversation about race. They really want to have that conversation. But the biggest barrier, it seems, is probably still the one that you were facing back in 2015, which is, and I hear it all the time, which is, I'm afraid I'll say the wrong thing. I'm afraid that it's not my place to bring it up. What is the answer for people who would like to be white allies who have those fears?
You know, there's a couple of things. One, I would say, whatever mistake it is that you're about to make has been made plenty of times. And I say that because part of how you can mitigate and reduce the amount of, you know, issues that arise when you try to talk about this is to do a little research. And I recommend that, you know, research how to talk about these topics, know a little background. Don't go into that completely ignorant of the topic. A lot of times what happens is people say, I just don't know where to start. So I'm going to dive in and I'm just going to start having a conversation. And they don't realize if they're saying something offensive, if they're asking the wrong person, you know, and a simple Google search, you know, a little quick check for the issue that you're hoping to talk about, spending even 10, 15 minutes can help you get a little bit of footing. So I would say it's important to recognize that, yes, these are really important discussions, but that importance means that you treat it with care. You know, you go into it knowing that you are talking about something serious. You are talking about something that impacts people's lives. So look into it a little bit ahead of time, but also know everyone messes these conversations up. People of color, white people, Black people, Native people, we all mess it up because we are all part of a system that actually doesn't want us to have the skills necessary to really talk about this. They don't want us to have a thorough understanding of how our systems work. Because if we did, it would be a lot easier for us to pull down these systems that, you know, a lot of people make their money from and hold their power from. So know that you're not the only person to stumble in these conversations, but also recognize that because we are programmed to not talk about these issues, that continuing to not move forward, to not be brave enough to really take those steps and risk some uncomfortable times means that you're continuing to keep the burden of systemic racism on the backs of non-white people, of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And that is not right. It's not fair. And so the worst case scenario of what would happen if you are a white person talking about race is nothing compared to what happens when you don't talk about it. But just do it with some care, you know? And the great thing about living in 2020 is that we have a wealth of information at our fingertips. And it won't be the end of the world if you stumble a bit, especially if you remember you're having these conversations not just to learn so that you'll be knowledgeable, but because you want to actually fix the system. And if you remember that, it will help you from feeling devastated if you got something wrong. It'll stop you from getting overly defensive if people point out where you've done something wrong, and it will keep you committed to doing better.
There's actually, I think, an even more basic question that's inherent in this, which is, who should you have that conversation with? So you make the great point, you know, that it should not be the people of color who are always the ones who have to educate you, educate the white people. But I do wonder, and you make also the great point, you know, we white people, white allies should be speaking with one another, speaking to those, you know, and calling out this behavior when we see it. At the same time, with the protests right now, race is so top of mind for the white community in a way that I don't think it has been in the modern era. For whites, this is new. For the Black community, I think I hear very often that it's exhausting. And in fact, I think you've spoken a little bit about that. There was a wonderful op-ed by a friend of yours, Damon Young, in the New York Times, who has also written about race extensively, and he said, "It's great that you guys want to talk about race. Great. Welcome to 1962," he says. And then he says, "I don't want to talk about race when I'm in line for ice cream." So what is I think that's part of the awkwardness is for the white audience, right? Is, do we talk to our Black friends about this, or do we wait for them to bring it up? And I do think that is part of the awkwardness.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to recognize a couple of things. One, I always recommend people do the math, right? When we look at the population, here in America, there is one of me for every 5 white people, right? And this means that whoever's coming to want to talk to me, pick my brain, process their emotions around figuring out that racism is bad, is not the first person, not the only person coming to me. I'm already overwhelmed by people, whether I do this work or not. And I've heard from so many, especially so many Black people recently, who are like, every white person I know is calling me and texting me right now. And it's really overwhelming. Do the basic math. Like, your question isn't new. It's not the first time it's been asked, and you're not the only person asking it. It's also really important to recognize too that what we're talking about when we talk about race and racism in America, we're talking about real labor on behalf of people of color to have these conversations. We're talking about diving into our own lived traumas. We're talking about really risking our relationships, our status, sometimes even our jobs, in order to move forward in these conversations. So that means that you have to actually treat that with respect. And it means that if the conversation has already been had, maybe we don't have to repeat it. I don't speak for free. I'm compensated for this talk. I'm compensated for pretty much every talk I give, because my effort, my scholarship, diving into my own personal trauma, talking about white supremacy, violent white supremacy that has impacted my life, takes a lot out of me, and I deserve to be compensated for it. But it also means that work exists to be utilized. And if you can look at the compensated work that people have done, or even the volunteered work that people of color have done to put information out there, and if you're not referencing it because you want your own personalized version, it's really an exploitation of someone's labor. It doesn't mean that you never talk to your friends, never talk to your community members. But what I always try to get people to think about is this useful to the BIPOC people that I want to talk to? Would this conversation be useful to them? And so often these conversations don't pass that basic muster. Coming up to someone and going, geez, I always wondered, what cultural appropriation is. If you pause and think, is this conversation useful to the person of color I'm talking to? It's not, right? They are not feeling better just because you have a better knowledge, because you haven't done any, you haven't done anything with them. But if you're saying, oh, I understand that you got upset about this costume. Can we talk about, you being upset, what I can do to help with that? Then that would be useful to them. So that's what I always say. The litmus test should be, are the efforts I'm doing here actually helpful, actually useful in mitigating the negative impacts that white supremacist systems have on BIPOC people? If it's not, then it's just about your own personal journey. But that can live within whiteness. You can do that with your therapist. You can do that with your friend group. But to take up someone's time, to ask them to share their own personal stories, to feel unsafe and uncomfortable just because you personally want to know more, or you personally want to feel better about something, is an exploitation of labor. So really, for me, even, because as a Black woman, I still have to do a lot of solidarity work, right? I still have to think about when I am in non-Black spaces or in spaces with other marginalized people about the questions I ask in the space I take up. And I'm constantly, my litmus test is this conversation, is this question, is this ask actually useful? Is it giving anything to the people I'm talking to? Because if it's not, then I'm exploiting it. Am I going to compensate that? Am I going to pay for that? Am I asking permission? Am I doing things to show that, I really care about the time and energy and, that I'm asking people to delve into for my own enlightenment?
That's actually a really interesting point you're making about the litmus test. And it explains a lot. I noticed in the book that you several times make the point that some variation of, if you're white, make sure this conversation is not about you. And I think that seems to be sort of the point you're making here with a litmus test. So
absolutely, there's this. It's a really there's like a. Oh, sorry. I was going to say there's a real complex right now. There's a real, like, what I like to call like the anti-racist industrial complex right now, where it's like this journey white people can go on. Like, I went to this retreat and it was just me and myself learning about whiteness, and I came back, you know, an enlightened person. And I keep thinking, at the end of the day, did you learn anything there that would actually be of use to how you are upholding systems that harm people of color? And if not, then you just went on a retreat, you know? And I think, like, a lot of times, even to a less extreme extent, the way we frame conversations around race are really about the edification and enlightenment of whiteness, and very little about undoing harm done to BIPOC people by systems of white supremacy.
Yeah, which brings up actually a really interesting point about the parallels that we're seeing now between the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter, because a couple of those things that you referenced, you know, back with the Me Too movement, you suddenly had the male allies who wanted to come and be part of that conversation, and now you have white allies who want to be part of this conversation. But so much of the discussion in Me Too was what you would call performative. It was saying, look what a great person I am, but there was no action, right? There was a lot of talk and not a lot of action. I wonder if we are in danger of the same sort of scenario playing out with Black Lives Matter, where you've got a lot of people who are out marching, but maybe not doing anything other than sort of performative, sort of the virtue signaling of saying, I'm a good person.
Absolutely. I think that we are always at risk for that, especially because we tend to center whiteness, just like we center maleness in all of our conversations, even conversations about oppression. And because we center whiteness, it's very tempting to try to sell racial justice to whiteness by saying, you'll be a better white person at the end. It'll make you better. You'll have these benefits. The problem that I find with that primarily, you know, first of all, yes, everyone is harmed by white supremacy. I've said before, and I'll say it again, white supremacy is this nation's oldest pyramid scheme. But there are parts of white supremacy, when you let go of that will cost whiteness. Right? It will cost the white person something. And if we constantly are trying to sell anti-racism to whiteness as how it benefits whiteness, what will happen is wherever it comes into conflict with white privilege or white benefit, it will be rejected. Also, it constantly undermines the basic importance and value of BIPOC people by saying it only matters if it can benefit white people. It's really easy right now for people to build these movements and say, well, I can get my aunt involved if she understands she's going to be a better person at the end of this. And it ends up being kind of like what I call this eat, pray, love journey, you know, through anti-racism, where someone envisions themselves coming out more pure, more whole, you know, more good. And very little do they think about, did I do anything that counts? Did I actually, you know, focus on systems? So even, you know, I am so excited about the protests we're seeing right now. But even online, you know, we see like the memification of discussion around Breonna Taylor. Very few of these posts actually have links of how you can contact, you know, city government and state government to try to get the cops who killed Breonna Taylor arrested, right? It'll just say, arrest the cops. Well, cool. I mean, if I could go arrest the cops, I'd go arrest the cops. But there's no actual education as to how to act, what to put behind that. And so I think a lot of times it's really important that we continuously ask, is this useful? Protest is absolutely useful. But if you go to a protest and you leave and everyone who was watching it has no idea exactly what you wanted, they may know you're upset about something, but they don't know what your actual goals of the protest are, then how effective was that protest? And I love protest. I think protest is so important. I think that we have seen protests where they go in and day out, and then we actually see a systemic change that comes out of it, right? And that's because people have been very clear. We are protesting for this. These are our demands. The same goes with your Facebook posts, with your Instagram posts, with the conversations you're having. If you're not thinking, how can I actually impact the system around me, then you're not really doing much. And what you're probably going to end up being is the person I see now today who, when I'm discussing something they've done that's racist, they'll say, oh, but I marched in the 60s. Okay, well, you're setting yourself up to be that person now, where someone will say, you haven't done anything, or you've done this thing that's harmful. Oh, well, I marched in 2020. Okay, well, what did you do that you can actually measure an impact for? And so I think that that's really important, that we continuously look and recognize it's not emotion, it's not sentiment, it's not lack of love that is harming BIPOC people in this country. It is how we are being treated by violent systems of white supremacy. And if you aren't looking at the system and figuring out your power within the system and trying to flex that power to change the system, you're not actually doing something that BIPOC people can feel.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, the white supremacist system. And how you describe it as a pyramid scheme. Let's just unpack that a little bit, because I think you make a great point in the book. Not everyone probably here has read the book, to explain why there are a lot of people who recoil at the thought of white supremacy, and they say, we would like you better, we'd listen to you more if you didn't use loaded language like that. But your point is, we need to use language like that. We need to face it. Can you talk a little bit about that and explain that why that is so important?
Absolutely. I think it's important to recognize that we need to define and call things what they are. And a system that is designed to trap people of color below white people socioeconomically and politically, and is designed to promise white people increased status for their cooperation in a capitalist system, is a system of white supremacy. It does not have to come with Klan hoods. It does not have to burn crosses. Its goal is the continued exploitation of all people for this promise of a racial hierarchy. And we have to call it what it is. And we have to be able to say that this either supports or dismantles a system of white supremacy, because the system is what is harming us. A lot of the way we look at white supremacy is by design. When I travel around and I ask people, when I say something's racist, what do you think? People will say Klan members, or they'll say Charlottesville now, or they'll say Trump. But they won't say our education system. They won't say our media. And that's because when we look at how white supremacy has been portrayed, it's portrayed as individuals who hate people of color and want them dead or want them demeaned. And you can tell who they are because they're the ones saying the slurs, carrying the signs, burning the crosses. But even when we look at the post-Reconstruction terror, in the early 1900s, what we had, even in chattel slavery, was not a system built around hate. It was a system built around exploitation that used hate to justify itself. And what was impacting people then was the exploitation of their labor, their disempowerment politically, their lack of stability, lack of infrastructure and resources. And it's the same things, just in different flavors, that are impacting our lives today, the same things that are killing us today. Yes, absolutely. Police violence matters. It is a huge issue, but it is simply the arm wing of white supremacy. And when it comes even with police encounters, what is impacting our lives is not just, we are, 3 times more likely to be shot dead. It is that we are far more likely to be, detained in the first place, to be handcuffed, to be harmed, that we're going to get longer sentences, that we are going to be given less opportunity to clear our records or to pay our fines. We're going to be given larger fines, right? All of these things, that's a whole system that is designed to ensure that some people benefit more than others, depending on your race and ethnicity. And so, while it hurts people to look at it, it's important to recognize that we aren't talking about intention. Your intention only matters how it motivates what you do. And if you have good intentions, your good intentions should motivate you to look at the system and say, we need to make change here. And so when you think about, really think what is harming BIPOC people. And this is, I think, something that's really hard for some white people to grasp, because if you haven't experienced widespread systemic discrimination, then the worst thing that may happen to you because of the color of your skin is going to be interpersonal, right? It's going to be someone called you a cracker, or someone said they didn't trust you because you're white, right? And that will be the worst of your interactions that have to do with race. And so when you think of what is harmful, and when you think of how it's been portrayed in the movies, it's interpersonal, interactions. But what is actually the worst for us, even if someone says, if someone at the office makes a racist joke about me, it's not the joke that harms me. It's knowing that that person has the power to hire or fire me, right? It's knowing that it plays into a stereotype that's going to not take me seriously and not respect me, right? It's going to stop people who look like me from even getting an interview. It's the systemic impact. But if you haven't experienced that systemic impact, you may not recognize that there's something much bigger and much deeper than how you like or love BIPOC people.
Yeah, you have a great line in the book, actually, where you talk about, white people could have nothing but love in their hearts for all people of color, and it doesn't make a difference if the system doesn't change. And you also reference some really simple ways to kind of understand that, which is, if you're a white person and you go to school, back to school night or the PTA meeting or whatever, and the PTA meeting is during the day, or the conferences are during the day, and the parents of color will be more likely to be those parents who have hourly jobs, who aren't able to get to so you should ask the question, why are we not accommodating these parents? You should ask the question, what percentage of the teachers in our school are teachers of color? And I think those sorts of you might consider them more subtle, but they are the systemic issues that you pinpoint that I think are quite eye-opening, and lead to your point as well about the importance of taking action, not just sort of, posting black squares on your Instagram account. You mentioned the police, and I actually would like to talk about that a little bit as well, because you do have a chapter on police brutality. It was interesting to me because you wrote that 5 years ago, and you don't use the phrase defunding the police. And I'm wondering sort of, where do you come down on that conversation?
Yeah, and that's definitely something where I read that chapter, and I read all of the statistics, everything I've listed, and I'm like, gosh, why would I even think of using the word reform here? Like, why? But when I think about the time, and even, I was talking to a friend of mine who is a leader in Black Lives Matter, and was in 2014, 2015. We honestly did not think at the time that we could get people to recognize that that's what needed to happen. I think if you had asked me personally, do you think that we can reform the police into doing something better? I could say we could reform the police to do a little less harm, but we would never get to something with the system without it. It would be completely unrecognizable when we were done if we were to do reform that was real enough to make it not a white supremacist, not a harmful, not an ableist and sexist institution. And I think that a lot of what we thought was possible as far as conversation, when we think about 2015, even 2016, even the phrase Black Lives Matter was super controversial, and it still is. So I'm so pleased to see that it has pushed way past that. I'm so pleased, honestly, because I think that I wish, I could put an addendum in there and be like, whoa. You know what? Actually, if you're reading this and absorbing this, I hope you can realize we can't actually perform this. And I think that it's important to look at where we are and continuously update our thoughts around this. So I'm actually super, super happy that some people are reading that chapter and going, why didn't you say defund? And some people are reading it and just going through the stats and going, defund, they're coming to that on their own, which is beautiful. But I also at times wish, I should have just gone for it. There are definite times I think where we become pragmatic to a default and think, okay, this is what people can hear. and say and what we can do. And at the time, we were also looking at things, like my frustration was not just the police structure itself, but recognizing that the prosecutors who were not pressing charges were going up unopposed for re-election, and, what can we do about that? But the truth is that true reform is going to take down most of our systems and replace them with something new. Because in the bedrock of almost all of our institutions is violent white supremacy.
So there are still an awful lot of people out there who say, but wait a second, it's just the bad cops. We need to get rid of the bad cops. Or it's the unions that are protecting the bad cops. That's what we have to fix, not the police as a whole. How do you respond to that?
There's a couple of things. One, I would say first and foremost, absolutely, the unions are atrocious, but the union leadership is voted in by the cops. Like, it's not like they're a separate entity that installs themselves, right? This is actually who police choose to represent themselves. So if you want to say, when you look at who they define as leaders and people who work in their best interests, it's people who time and time again are defending this violent brutality over and over again. So even looking at the unions and looking at the horrible statements and looking at how often, union leaders themselves have horrific records of abuse in their own police records, and knowing that that was all information that was available to police, and they decided that's the leader for me, should say a lot about police in general, right? That was the majority of the vote. But also, I would say, I was talking with Janaea Khan, and they were co-founder of Black Lives Matter Toronto, and now work in LA still with Black Lives Matter and Color of Change, do amazing work. And they said something that was so crystal clear to me when talking about defunding, which was wealthy, upper middle class and upper class white communities already live in a society that is pretty much the way a defunded society would look for police. So their contact with police is minimal. They know that if someone in their family is having a mental health crisis, that there will be people to call who are not going to come trained to kill, that there will be professionals who will come with their best interests at heart, who will help and give loving care to the people they love who are in crisis. They know that if their child gets in a fight at school, their child will not be dragged off and sent to juvenile detention. They know that if their kids shoplift because they're acting out, their child will not be handcuffed and taken off to jail. They know that if someone is speeding through the neighborhood, that no one is going to pull a gun on their car, right? They know this because they live in a society where police are designed to protect and serve. Very rarely are the police actually brought into their lives. They're literally only brought into their lives for life and death situations and for, an occasional rowdy party, right? But for the most part, private security deals with most of these issues. Trained professionals for mental health and medical issues are brought in. They know that their lives are not in danger, that someone sent trained to kill is not interacting with them. That is actually what it looks like to have defunded police, where you basically take money out of the spaces where cops should not be doing these things and put them where it belongs. Another thing Janaea said that was amazing, that's true, which is cops don't prevent crime, they respond to crime. But we are sending in people trained to kill after crime has already occurred, after incidences have already occurred. So if I am speeding on the highway, someone trained to kill is pulling me over. If someone broke into my house and left, someone trained to kill is coming to look at my house. If I'm sexually assaulted, someone trained to kill is going to come and interview me. If my son is shoplifting, someone trained to kill is going to detain him. None of that is necessary. It doesn't mean that we don't have responders for things like school shooter situations. It means that we recognize that we treat everyone with care, with proper care, and we put money where we have the care, and we take it out of systems that have been shown to be hyper-violent and to abuse people based on their race, ability, and gender.
And as you point out, Black drivers are 23% more likely to be pulled over than white drivers are. They're 1.5 to 5 times more likely to be searched for contraband, and yet they are less likely than whites to have contraband on them after the search. And they are 3.5 to 4 times more likely to be killed by cops than whites are. So it is obviously a very different experience. And every Black parent I know has had the conversation, particularly with their Black sons, about what to do when you are pulled over, not if, but when you are pulled over. So there's another issue here that arises and that is newly fresh, even though it's been around for a while, which is about anti-racist training and anti-bias training. And I'd love to get your perspective on this. The New York Times just wrote a big piece questioning whether it would work or not. This is something I actually have chapters devoted to this in my book that's called That's What She Said, where I look at bias training for women. They quote in the Times piece a Harvard professor I've spoken with a lot named Frank Dobbin, who has looked at 30 years of corporate diversity training and found that for the most part it has failed. It's often backfired, in fact, and made things even worse, largely because of backlash against the training by the primarily white men who are subject to the training. I guess what my question would be, do you think, is there some sort of training, something that we can do that actually would be effective in terms of anti-racist training?
Yeah, and I think that this is such an important debate that we're having, a discussion we're having right now. Because there is a ton of money in this industry. There are people becoming quite wealthy in this industry, and there is very little accountability built around it. And oftentimes this work, the very important diversity training or DEI training, diversity, equity, and inclusion training, is done really to serve corporate purposes and not to actually aid or make things better for marginalized people in those environments. So oftentimes the primary complaints that I hear that really resonate with me around this sort of training is oftentimes it is used to prevent lawsuits, right? We're going to bring someone in who's going to teach you how to not say the racist thing that's happening here. We're going to teach you how to use proper verbiage, but we're not actually going to look at the structure of this building. We're not going to look at how we're hiring, how we're firing, what we're investing in. We're going to say, don't say this at the water cooler. And then when someone complains that things are racist, they will have less of a leg to stand on. And oftentimes that's how this training is used. It's used because companies want the discussions to stop, not because they want them to continue, because they want to make sure that they can effectively gaslight marginalized employees by making everything appear on the surface like it's right. I think that there are a couple of things we need to look at. When I look at the effectiveness and when I do talks in corporate spaces, a lot of times I spend time thinking, what is the most I think can come out of this? And I rarely think I'm going to come out of here having changed the culture. So I focus on reaffirming the humanity of BIPOC people in this space and maybe giving credible support to what they've been working on. Because oftentimes BIPOC people are undercut time and time again in their efforts. They are usually the ones who know best. They work in the space, what needs to happen. And so coming in and trying to reaffirm what they've been saying, giving them space to breathe a little and maybe take the pressure off of them is oftentimes the number one benefit I think can come out of this. I think we oftentimes undercut the basic healing and humanity that needs to happen for BIPOC people who are kind of trapped in these hostile corporate environments. A lot of times the benefit is always, did we make the white people better? Not did we help and heal the BIPOC people in these spaces? Second, then it really should be structural. We define what is appropriate and what is not, and there is always pushback for that. But we especially get pushback when we come from the whole, we're going to educate people so that they feel differently about it. I don't honestly think that that's the role that should be the role of DEI work. Like I said, I don't come into a space trying to create a better, more enlightened white person. I come into a space to reaffirm the safety and humanity of BIPOC people. And so there are things, if someone hits someone, in the workplace. We don't have multiple meetings about why it's bad to hit. We don't try to convince people that violence is wrong. We say this is appropriate behavior and this is inappropriate behavior. And people work within those boundaries. And we, for some reason, refuse to do that when it comes to race and equity. We refuse to say this is appropriate for a place that values equity and this is inappropriate, and we will act within these boundaries. But the rest of the work has to be done structurally. So companies that are invested financially in white supremacy, companies that have built their entire hiring, promotion, all of those systems around white supremacy are never going to do effective DEI work. And none of that has to be done with listening sessions, with therapy sessions, right? That is done with working out new systems. And that's really where professionals who actually know systemically where the, racism lies in corporations can actually do the work. But that is often not the last thing that corporations actually want when it comes to DEI. They don't want to come out a different organization. They don't want to come out with a different profit model. They want to come out with as little effort as possible and just feeling better about themselves.
Yeah, when you're talking about structural issues, and there are certainly things that we know can work. I mean, having a wage gap analysis, having a promotion gap analysis, having an opportunity gap analysis, all of these things are very possible and actually can help companies that would want to make significant change and not just make themselves feel better. But I also found interesting, though, in terms of that anti-racism training, that times piece, even the times piece, focused on, and there are so many anti-racism, people in this field who are people of color in this field. And if you look at there's the top 10 books on the bestseller list are books like yours, including yours. But the one that they focused on is the one and only one, I believe, that is written by a white person, which I also found ironic. But I guess it did bring up a question for me. I mean, can or should white people be leading anti-racism training? Do you need to be a person of color who's experienced it to be effective in leading in that field?
I believe so. And I believe, honestly, too, it's not as if there are a lack of BIPOC people who are trained and effective in this work. It's just that they're not who people look to. I believe that there is something very wrong, ethically wrong, with making your living off of the continuation of white supremacy while saying you're dismantling white supremacy. Because the truth is, as long as that system exists, you're making money. And if you're a white person making that money, it doesn't sit right with me at all. But also because privilege is lifelong learned. White privilege is lifelong learned. And I do not believe even our foremost white scholars on that have been able to find all of the ways in which that lives inside of them. Just like I would not be giving a talk on disability because ableism is lifelong learned. I can speak competently to it. I can try to include it in my talk so that I am not erasing people. But to take up the primary space to make myself wealthy off of that would be unethical to me, but also impractical. I always believe, I do believe that there are absolutely spaces for white people in this work, 100%. And in fact, I think that there are spaces where white people need to do the work away from BIPOC people, like where you decompress, where you kind of process what you're learning, right? Those kind of group conversations. I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to be in that conversation while someone who's just figured out white supremacy exists talks about what it means to them, because I've dealt with that my whole life. And honestly, I want people to be able to process that where they feel safe and then continue on with the work. But that work should always be informed by BIPOC people and should be accountable to BIPOC people. And the primary people who should benefit from that work financially and from the changes that you're making should always be BIPOC people. And I think that if you're a corporation saying we're going to try to do what we can to undo white supremacy, and your first thought is, who's the white person that we can send tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to help make that happen, you need to stop and think, am I really actually committing myself to undoing the white supremacy in the way that I thought I was?
So we have a whole bunch of questions coming in. We're going to try and get to as many as we can in the next 13 minutes. speed round here. The first question is, if there is another chapter or an issue that you could add or expand upon in your book, what would it be?
Oh yeah, so I definitely talked about this in the paperback of some things that I wish I could have added. I would absolutely love to talk more about Indigenous issues. I really do regret not having more to that. Also, you know, I really skipped talking about biracial and immigrant experiences, even though both of those are kind of in my life as a biracial Black woman whose father was an immigrant from Nigeria. And what I realized in the years since the book came out from the emails I got is, while people from those experiences have definitely gotten use from the book, I get a lot of questions of where exactly do I fit in this conversation? And that is definitely something I could have spoken to that I would love to have added. And probably talked a little more, I did touch on it in places here and there, on the intersections of disability and race as well.
Second question is, can you speak a little bit more about microaggressions?
Yeah, absolutely. So the term microaggressions doesn't actually mean that they do micro harm. Microaggressions are the everyday slights and reminders that you are not safe and you aren't welcome. And, you know, I think of them as, you know, the little kicks, the little hits that keep your heart rate, you know, pumping, that keep you feeling like you're in fight or flight mode, that keep you feeling like you can never relax, can never rest, but also send a message to everyone around you that you are different, that you don't belong, that you don't, you know, deserve to be treated the same way that other people are. And so microaggressions happen all of the time, and it's a cumulative effect. And it's an effect that not only hurts our spirits, but also raises our blood pressure, you know, causes us to become ill, impacts our job prospects, impacts our mental health and safety. And so they happen all of the time. And when you think about all of the ways in which microaggressions can be perpetrated against BIPOC people, chances are you will find that you have participated in some, even if you're a person of color, against a person of another race or ethnicity. And it's important to take responsibility not only for the harm you individually did, but how that added to the cumulative impact of microaggressions. And, you know, I would recommend that people read up on microaggressions and listen to the things that are said and done that BIPOC people have reported, because you will recognize some things that you have said or done. And you need to stop doing those things, and you need to try to do what you can to undo the harm that you've done by those things. But also, if you're a BIPOC person, know that the way it's impacting you, that's real, it's valid. That pain, that hurt, that's all really valid. That really did happen to you.
It's also, I mean, it's a great point to your earlier point about educate yourself, right? These are things that you can read up on and you will recognize in yourself. Another question comes about on the defunding the police conversation. Is there another issue that you could name where there's a bold vision, not incrementalism, that is needed?
I mean, I think that so many of our systems would benefit from bold vision. I think our education system, I think that we see pockets of bold vision in some of the independent schools where they're starting from the ground up and saying, wow, this whole system that was really built off of elitism and white supremacy maybe isn't, you know, can't just be tweaked here and there. When we look at our education system, look at the extreme lack of teachers of color, look at how many of our BIPOC students are being arrested out of school, suspended, expelled from schools, or sent to special education when they have no disabilities. When we look at the opportunity gap when it comes to testing, when we look at college enrollment differences, when we look at student safety, we see a huge problem that goes throughout every ounce of the system. And I do not think it is that easy to simply reform that when our testing system, our SATs, our colleges, our preschools are ripe with white supremacy. And so I absolutely think that the next conversation we have where we need to have really bold vision is going to be in education.
There's actually another question relating to defunding the police. This one is says, the term defunding the police does not fit well with many Americans, including me, the questioner, as a person of color. It creates an unintended perception. How do you recommend that we could change the narrative to better communicate positive structural changes that could be done?
So I'm always confused when people say this. I really am, because the truth is that every term we come up with that causes major change, and we are asking for major change, is considered too harsh. And I've realized it's not the term, it's the word. Because when we say defund the police, we actually mean defund the police. It's not the term. We literally mean a process of taking money out of the police and putting it into community resources that can better, address community issues and actually reduce crime instead of criminalizing people. We mean defund. That's what we mean. And so if that doesn't sit right with you, I think sit with it and wonder why. Why does a drastic departure from a violent system not sit right with you? Why is that so difficult when we are 400 years into showing that the system does not want to be reformed? The system resists every attempt at reform. Why wouldn't you want to defund it? And so, yes, absolutely, educate yourself as to what goes into defunding. But I think if we called it fluffy bunnies for police, it doesn't matter, because when we get to the details, and in the end, it ends up being a completely changed system where we are completely taking ourselves away from this system and replacing it with something more equitable, it's going to make people uncomfortable. And you need to ask why. Why are you so attached to a system that really brings such harm to so many of our communities for such little benefit? And we need to also step away from the propaganda out there and recognize that these cop shows, these law and order shows, none of this is happening. None of us actually live in a city where people are being murdered left and right multiple times a day, and dogged cops are out there chasing down the bad people and finding them, right? We don't live in these cities where they are making up evil criminal masterminds that are going around slaughtering people for fun over and over and over again, and cops are keeping us safe from them. That's not the society we live in. We live in a society where we have socioeconomic differences that are leading to increases in crime in certain areas. And our response is not to actually address those socioeconomic issues, to address community trauma. It's instead to incarcerate. And we have to step away from that system. We have to step away from the ways in which we have absorbed that propaganda and actually say, what are cops doing? And when I asked my mom the other day, because she was uncomfortable with the phrase, and I said, what are cops for? And she was like, oh, keeping you safe. I'm like, no, I want you to actually think of the scenarios. What are cops for? What are you using them for in your life right now? Think about that, and think about what we actually need police for and what we don't. And defunding is simply the act of saying, we are not going to fund the things we don't need you for. We're going to put that into competent professionals. And what we have that will actually do what we think of cops, which is the person that's going to save us if there's an active shooter, the person that's going to, make sure that we're not running over people in the street. We will keep for that, but we will do it in a way where it's appropriate to the job. Everything else needs to go to people who are actually trained to do that work.
So I do think that a lot of the discomfort with defunding is people who see it as taking 100% of the funds away from the police, as in destroying the police. We are running out of time, but there's another question. Good question here on social. Oh, I'm sorry. Go on.
No, I was just going to say, one thing I hope people will pause and think about is rendering that people have been doing this work for a long time, people calling to defund the police. We are not, it's a process. It doesn't mean you wake up tomorrow and nothing exists. We all want to be safe. And so recognize that in this system, in this process, it's something that starts from conversation, from debate, and from people working out what works best. It's not just the police no longer exist. So have some faith in communities of color and in activists who've dedicated decades of their life to this work, that we want more than anything to keep our communities safe. And we would not immediately jump to a plan that would make us.
So this is our last question. We're running out of time. This went so fast. Here's the question. How can I acceptably use social media as a platform to support and create change? And as a young person, what can I do besides sharing activism-related posts and signing petitions?
Absolutely. So a couple of things I would say when you're talking about things on social media, find the action item. Find the thing you can do in community. Is this something you show up for? Is this something you call about? Is this something you donate to? Put action items in your post. If it's just people need to be aware of this, why do people need to be aware of it? What do you want them to do with that information? Make sure that you are doing that. Use social media also to strategize, to get people to join you. You know, if you're going to show up at a virtual town hall meeting, get other people to join you with that, to voice concerns, right? If you're going to talk about an issue people need to donate to, get other people to donate, right? Think collaboratively and think about what action you can inspire. As a young person, I think it is so important to recognize that you live in your own system that is effectively impacting the lives of BIPOC people your age as well. And so it is not just, I can't vote yet, maybe, or I don't have money in this system, or politicians don't care about me. It's, I have a peer group that is setting norms that will stick with them for decades. What is my peer group doing? How are we educating ourselves? What is acceptable in my schools, in my friend groups, in my communities? What action are we taking? Do we feel like we have spaces to elevate the voices of issues that are impacting young people of color as well, not just people my age and older, right? Am I elevating those voices? Are we having those conversations? Are we talking about, you know, gender and race? Are we talking about ability and race? Are we making sure that when we are basically, which is what youth are doing, is setting up their own model societies for when they take over broader society, does this model society actually reflect what I want things to look like when I'm 40 and 50? And if it doesn't, you need to do that work. You have a lot of power within your circle, within the systems that you're in. Are you talking to your teachers? Are your teachers really teaching equitably? You know, do you know, like, your school's suspension and expulsion rate for students of color? Like, do you know what's in your textbooks? You know, flex your power where you have it and know that it all counts, because what's happening to you is real. What's happening to your peers of color is real, and it absolutely matters.
So we are now just about out of time. Ijeoma Oluo, I want to thank you so much for this remarkable conversation, and also for giving us all actual items that we can take with us that we can act on. But thank you so much. And I'm going to turn this over now to Hillary, who is the head of the Friends of the Greenwich Library. And thank you for having us.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Hillary Martin-Lay, the chairman of the Friends of Greenwich Library. And on behalf of the Friends and the Board of Trustees, I'd like to thank Ijeoma Oluo and Joanne Lipman for this fabulous conversation, this very useful conversation about becoming anti-racist and being better allies. The library's mission is to provide exceptional resources, programs, and services to our entire community. And I think we have really lived into that mission with this event this evening. We could not do it without the help of our outstanding library staff. And we are so grateful that all of you tuned in tonight and joined the conversation. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.